Welcome to tonight's History at Home, From Bloomers to Bikinis, a brief history of beachwear. My name is Casey Johnson. I'm the Communications and Programs Director at the Legacy of the Lakes Museum, and I'm here to tell you tonight all about the history of beachwear up until the modern era. This is a collaboration between Alexandria Community Education, the Douglas County Historical Society, Legacy of the Lakes Museum and Gardens, and the Runestone Museum Foundation. History Happens Here is kind of the slogan for all three museums, and it is an incredible community asset to have those three museums here in town, and we greatly enjoy getting together and putting on these presentations for you, and we hope that you will continue to give all three museums and Alexandria Community Education your support. Before we dive on in, I do want to clear up some of the phrasing I will be using throughout this presentation. Although they are used interchangeably today, bathing suits and swimming suits, or costume if you're in the UK, historically have meant different things, and you'll see that pop up a lot during this presentation. Bathing costumes historically are what people wore to bathe or clean up, particularly where public baths were concerned. Later, this evolved to mean bathing, like what we would today call wading, which was generally a feminine pastime and something we'll get into later. As swimming for fun and sport became more prominent in the 19th and 20th century, you start to see the term meaning swimsuit and bathing suit used interchangeably. So men wore swimming suits because they were swimming, women wore bathing suits because they were bathing, right around that Victorian era. But eventually they do come to mean the same thing. So I will try to stick as best as I can through using the proper term as we go through the presentation. However, I do interchange them a lot in my everyday life, and I'm sure it might happen during this presentation. So in ancient times, men and women bathed either naked or with simple undergarments. Women had bandeau style and tops and a piece of cloth that wrapped around their groin area, not unlike a modern bikini. Men wore loincloths similar to Japanese fundoshi on the lower half of their bodies, and that is kind of a garment that tucks between the legs and then is twisted up the back that kind of looks like a thong, and then ties to a waistband. So that's what that's called. In public bathhouses throughout history, they've been both segregated by sex and not. They have kind of different ideas about modesty than we do today, and so bathing naked wasn't really that taboo back then in a public bathhouse. And then in all depictions we have of men and women actively swimming, it shows them all naked. So that's kind of where we sit in ancient Greece or Rome. The Middle Ages saw men and women bathing together in both indoor and outdoor public bathing spaces. And again, this was typically done naked, as evidenced by illustrations from that time. Other depictions do show them all with cloths wrapped around just the groin area. Again, the ideas of modesty that we have today still hadn't become the norm during the early medieval period, but by the late era, a 1548 law in Germany did require that bathers wear cloth around the groin or they would face a fine. Swimming and outdoor bathing in the Renaissance period was condemned and discouraged by the Catholic Church, and so there was little need for garments specifically for swimming and outdoor bathing. So if you were bathing in the privacy of your home, you would just do it naked if you were alone. By the 17th century, health spas started to appear and they encouraged bathing. Prior to 1670, women would bathe nude in female-only spas. After that, they wore a canvas-type garment that is described here. It says the ladies go into the bath with garments made out of fine yellow canvas, which is made stiff and made large with great sleeves like a parson's gown. The water fills it up so that it is borne off your shape, is not seen. It does not cling close as other linings, which looks sadly like a poorer sort that go in their own lining. And then gentlemen wore drawers and waistcoats of the same sort of canvas. So the idea here, and this is where you really start to see the ideas of modern modesty take shape, The garments are described that they float away from your body and hide what your body looks like so that people couldn't see what it looked like. And that comes from Celia Fiennes in 1687. The 18th and early 19th centuries, it became fashionable to seek out healing waters in the 18th, 19th, and even into the 20th century. So you start to see resort towns spring up like Bath in England, and seaside resorts like Brighton also in England. In 1737, the Bath Corporation, which was in Bath, England, issued an official bathing dress code. No male over the age of 10 was to be without a pair of drawers and a waistcoat, and no female was permitted to swim without a decent shift upon their bodies. A shift is a type of undergarment which is usually white and floor length. Around this era, we also see the appearance of, we start to see the appearance of a bathing gown, which is loose, ankle-length, full-sleeve gown made out of wool or linen to preserve modesty. These were often weighted at the hem so that they didn't float up and were worn with black stockings to prevent show through. There was a separation of men and women at this time too, unless you were married, and even then, scandalous. There was this idea that men were actively swimming and women were bathing, what we would think of as wading. However, in the country and among the lower classes, many swam and bathed in rivers, lakes, and streams, and this was done naked or with simple underclothes. Industry and modern innovations were starting to blur the lines between the classes, and so modesty was a way in which the upper class individuals differentiated from themselves from the lower classes. So the lower classes swam naked in streams, upper class people wore bathing gowns and modesty garments. So it was just one of the ways that they enforced these differences. And you can see here in the picture, these are depictions of bathing gowns in Brighton, England, about 1830. So you can see they're wearing those full-sleeved ankle-length dresses as they frolic. There's one woman there who's being helped by two assistants, and she seems terrified. There's also some women who seem to be actively swimming, which is encouraging. So it's nice to know that even though it was considered the norm that women shouldn't swim, there, of course, were women who went against the grain and did so anyway. So starting in the Regency era and moving into the 20th century, a popular way to swim was with a bathing machine. And again, this was all about modesty. They're basically cabanas on wheels, and people could enter the machine and change into their garments and then depart once the machines were out into the water, and they were moved in and out using horses. There were sometimes attendants for those who could not swim, and even fabric-type cones that allowed you to swim completely hidden from view. You can actually see in this character on the left here that the women are rushing to stay hidden by the cones because the male bathers are way too close. They are, trying to peep on them. And there's another one from the same artist actually that shows men on shore with telescopes trying to get a view of the ladies there so that they can see them in their wet garments. Moving into the Victorian era, we're going to first look at men. In the UK, men's nude bathing and swimming were banned completely in 1860. In the United States, there was never a widespread ban on nude swimming, though individual towns and cities did have their own ordinances, but fashions tended to follow the UK in terms of swimwear. At first, they wore a pantaloon-style undergarment, but the sight of naked male chests soon became so improper that they started having to wear one- and two-piece suits that covered them completely. Men's swimwear in the Victorian era emphasized their masculinity, using dark colors, no frills, and a solid square look. They started off as rather shabby and mimicked traditional undergarments, but went through many improvements over time. Stripes were rather popular, as you can see in this character from the 1870s, and then the other one from the 1890s as well. These were first made out of knitted wool that stretched and absorbed less water than cotton. Even so, when wet, these suits could weigh up to 9 pounds. There were complaints that they were not streamlined enough for athleticism, and soon man-made materials came onto the market, including rubber and later nylon. So again, you'll see here both young boys and men are wearing kind of the typical style of the time, knee length, shoulders covered. That was considered the most modern and proper. So moving on to the women. So Victorians despised nudity in any form, but especially in women. Women's bathing costumes covered them from neck to ankle and added more fabric than the simple shifts of the previous period. In the mid-19th century, women's costumes consisted of Turkish-style trousers that tied at the ankle and an overdress type garment that went down to the knees and had high necks and long sleeves. And heaven forbid, don't forget your bonnet to cover your hair. It's very improper for you to have an uncovered head out in public. As you can imagine, these costumes were not ideal for active swimming, but rather bathing, and they were quite dangerous as well. They could weigh well over 20 pounds when wet and were made up to 9 yards of wool. Lower class women, again, if they had the luxury of going swimming or bathing, would likely just stick to simple undergarments. And I have to laugh at this cartoon from the era showing these like crinoline, like privacy bathing outfits. I couldn't find if they were legitimate or not, but that just kind of gives you the idea of the modesty that the Victorians were known for. Finishing out this, so the Victorian era is an umbrella term for a period that lasted over 64 years. And over that time, fashions changed dramatically, and swimwear was no different. These suits shown here are from 1862 and show the French-style deviation from knee-length overdresses to ones that just rise up to the hips. And notice that the full-length trousers are still remain in effect, although one woman is bold enough to have short sleeves. But again, they're French, and apparently that was considered what the French did at that time. Finishing out the century, the trousers have become knee-length, although thick stockings were still needed to make an outfit proper. The silhouette has also changed to match the more popular feminine shape of the day. The costume here on the left shows an all-important accessory, the bonnet. And then while tan is in now, back then tans and freckles were not considered desirable, and this was yet another way that women protected themselves from tans and freckles. It was a way to keep distinction between the classes, as the working women and the poor had tan skin, while upper-class women could maintain their paleness because they didn't work. So that was kind of how they did that. The costumes in the middle here are from the 1890s and reflect one of the largest fashion trends of the decade, leg-o mutton sleeves. Those are those giant sleeves. And again, not really about swimming, more about being seen and showing fashionable styles. And then also shown here is a bathing corset. This would help maintain the fashionable silhouette of the day, even while in a bathing costume. While more women were becoming active, women's bathing costumes were still not designed for active swimming. And this is just one of the other example of why, like how they weren't. But even so, both many women's and health advocates were already disparaging the use of corsets, especially when participating in physical activity. In an 1896 Harper's Bazaar article, they called it an essential part of the costume. But by 1901, the Book of Women's Sports decried the use of bathing corsets or any corset at all during physical activity. You'll also notice in the middle ad that there are a lot of stripes, and it's what's known as sailor style. And this was just a very, very popular design trend of the time. You know, you're at the beach, sailors, it kind of just goes. And you see this starting all the way as early back as the Regency in most fashions, typically for young boys. But by the Victorian era, you do see it in adult women and men. Stripes are in. So moving on to the Progressive Era. I'm going to set the stage for the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era saw a lot of different social changes for both men and women. A rise in production and manufacturing, as well as mass-produced goods, contributed to a growing middle class. Unions campaigning for workers' rights meant that soon there was more leisure time to be had among the lower and middle classes, although it was still mostly the middle class. And women were experiencing freedom like never before, thanks to inventions like the bicycle and public transportation. No longer did they need someone to escort them about. They could go out and about on their own. They were attending university, participating in athletic pursuits, and becoming a growing component in the workforce. Women were also heavily campaigning for the right to vote. younger women were also rebelling against the constrictive fashions of their elders. And here is where you really start to see this butting of heads between the traditional swimming costumes of the past and the more modern, freeing costumes that was desired by the youth. This era was a catalyst for many changes, and these can be seen reflected through swimsuit styles. But again, you still have those two values coming to a head. And here you can see in this one photo here on the left, it's the most popular silhouette of the early 1900s was the S-curve, which was actually extremely dangerous. It forced the bosom kind of forward and then your hips pulled back in a kind of exaggerated S shape. It was only in fashion for a few years because it was actually very dangerous, and most people did recognize that at the time. But I think it's hilarious that these women are still doing that even though they are just swimming. And then this other photo is actually from Lake Lahamadou, circa 1907, and you can see she's gotten rid of her skirt altogether and is just going in a kind of bloomer style one piece. Speaking of that photo, here are a few more from the same family. So you have some of them chilling on Lake Lahamadou, circa 1905, 1910. He is showing a lot of angle, which is kind of scandalous, but still has that popular swim style of the day. And those girls are also reflected wearing that popular swim style of the day. And then there's a whole picture of the whole Anderson Pratt family, again on Lake Lahamadou. And you can see a very varied styles of swimwear in those photos as well. So many women and girls still did not know how to swim. Competitive swimming was becoming popular with both men and women in the upper and middle classes. Women were learning to swim in school, but they still did not, there were still many who did not have the opportunity or luxury of learning how to swim. The catalyst for change was unfortunately due to a disaster, as most catalysts are. On June 15, 1904, members of the St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church of New York, mostly German immigrants, chartered a side-wheel passenger steamboat to carry them to a church picnic. Most of those on board were women and children. A fire broke out at about 9:30 a.m. on the ship. Eventually, it was burning so out of control that people began to evacuate the ship. However, unfortunately, safety protocols had been ignored by the builder. The fire hose was rotted and was useless when they tried to use it. Lifeboats were tied up and inaccessible, and life preservers were relatively useless. Some mothers reported that they put the life jackets on their children only to watch in horror as their children drowned when the life vests fell apart before their eyes. The fatalities of the general slocum were mostly women and children because they did not know how to swim. The women's heavy gowns and petticoats were also a factor as they became so heavy and dragged them beneath the water. It's estimated that about 1,021 people, most of them women, about 1,000 women and children, out of 1,342 died in the disaster. It was the largest disaster in New York history in terms of loss of life until September 11, 2001, and it is the second largest maritime disaster on the United States waterways. Enter Annette Kellerman, Australia's original mermaid. She was born with a weakness of legs, and her parents enrolled her in swimming classes to help strengthen them. By 15, her disability had disappeared, and she was giving diving displays. She continued to swim and set records. She was one of the first women to attempt to swim the English Channel, and she was also responsible for helping to popularize synchronized swimming as a sport. She's also the first woman who ever appeared fully nude in a movie in 1916. After the general slocum disaster, she often gave swimming demonstrations, believing that women should know how to swim. When visiting America in 1907, Kellerman was reportedly appalled by the cumbersome suits that women were forced to wear to swim. She staged a protest on Revere Beach near Boston by wearing a one-piece man's suit and was immediately arrested for indecent exposure. So in this picture here, you can see that she's got stockings sewn onto the bottom of this suit. The suit she wore in 1907 did not have that, which is an important distinction. At the trial, Kellerman allegedly stated, "What difference is there from these legal costumes than wearing lead chains around our legs? Women can't learn to swim wearing more stuff than you can hang on a clothesline." She asked the judge how many more women would have to die because they didn't learn to swim. She brought in a modified man's one-piece, which was sleeveless, but she had sewn black stockings on the leg, technically meeting the legal requirements. The judge allowed that women could wear the suits provided they wore robes before and after entering the water, and this was really a start of beginning of change. Kellerman essentially sold suits based off the suit she had brought into the courtroom, and the picture here is an example of that suit. So Kellerman's tight-fitting suit was, while it was innovative, it took a while to catch on because, again, those ideas of modesty. Most women's suits had shorter sleeveless tops with drop necklines as well as shorter bloomers. Legs started to become more socially acceptable as well, but suits were still rather loose-fitting. While the new suits were still not focused on active swimming as an athletic pursuit, those options did exist for women. In the 1912 Olympics, women from 9 out of 17 countries took part in swimming costumes like Kellerman's, but the United States refused to allow women to participate because of the suits. And so you still have those ideas of modesty coming head to head with these growing ideas of women's athleticism. By the 1920s, though, suits were shorter and starting to resemble costumes that you would more wear for athletic pursuits. And then looking at the lovely men, men donned a one-piece tank suit starting during the 1910s, or one-piece suits with short sleeves. Again, these are usually in dark, solid colors and expose the elbows and knees. Carl Jansen figured out how to make a tight knit wool unitard with rib stitching that allowed for a closer fit, making the suits more streamlined in water. Here he is in the photo, he's second from right, and he was the founder of Portland Knitting Company, which eventually became known as Jansen, who were makers of men and women's athletic wear for decades. And actually you can't see it in the photo, but these suits are bright green with yellow stripes. And so when they were demonstrating them, they called them froggers, which is kind of funny. And then men's and women's suits just kept getting shorter and shorter throughout the decade. But so again, you're starting to see these ideas of modesty kind of being shaken off and athleticism kind of replacing that. However, that doesn't mean that there wasn't extreme pushback to this. In the United States in 1917, there was something called bathing suit regulations, which were published. Male bathing suits needed a skirt for modesty, or men could wear knee-length flannel pants with a vest. There were no bare chests allowed. That's a huge no-no. And then women's suits should be no more than 6 inches above the knee. They even employed regulators on beaches who would follow women around and measure just to make sure that the rules were being followed. However, at this point, change was inevitable and it was fast coming. So in the 1920s and 30s, and we're going to start with the men here, the new fabrics like rayon and latex were introduced in this era, and suits became more body conscious and athletic. In the 1930s, high-waisted suits inspired by the Art Deco became extremely popular. Special supports were sewn into trunks called sunaka that helped meet modesty requirements. And then there was also Olympian Johnny Weissmuller who gave input on the new design. He recommended lower cut arms on the tank top and a naturally fitting waist attached to a pair of trunks, the world's first. And they debuted in France. However, the US erred on the side of modesty as the trunks were still extremely short. Often buckles and buttons were added to try to distract from the shortness. We'll call it the shortness of the suit. So you want a buckle or a belt there to be distracting. This is also where you see a multi-wear suit called the men's topper appear in 1933, and it had a removable top, which is what this model here is modeling. However, it was still illegal to be without a top on US beaches. It wasn't until, and I do want to mention, when I mention trunks, it's not the style of swim trunk we talk about today. It's actually like a brief style, so it fits more closely again with these models here. That's a trunk. So in 1937, that is when men were finally legally allowed to swim bare-chested, but they often were publicly shamed for doing so. And so you can see in this above photograph, like only one man is brave enough to go shirtless, and even he is kind of covering himself up with a towel. So in the 1920s and 30s, you also see sleeves disappearing on women. This is, again, just dramatic changes. So women's suits, necklines plunged in the back of suits, so still relatively high up in the front, but in the back, that's open game. Sleeves disappeared, and sides often contained cutaways and were tightened, so the suits were much more form-fitting. And often the shoulder straps could be lowered for tanning, and we have Coco Chanel to thank for making a tan look popular. The leg was still cut pretty straight across the upper thighs for modesty, and shoulder blades were still considered immodest. So Claire Dennis was disqualified from the 1932 Olympics because her suit had a racer back design that showed off her shoulder blades, but by 1936 it did become the norm. But still, you see in everyday swimwear, so the Olympics took a while, but in everyday swimwear, backs were in. And I do also want to mention that it's a common misconception that the two-piece suit was invented in the 1940s. Two-piece suits began showing up in the 1930s, such as with actress Jane, I know it says Wyman there, that was a mistake on my part. This is Jane Powell. She's seen here wearing a two-piece suit. They were still considered indecent to wear in public outside of swimming venues, though. So you don't really wear this on the beach, even though she is. She's a celebrity, though, so scandalous. But typically you wouldn't wear them in public beaches. And there are two key differences between these suits and the bikini that would come later. And we'll see if you can figure them out by the time we get there, but I will talk about them. So in the 1940s, wartime fabric rationing meant that men's suits became shorter and tops were discarded altogether. And there were rations on suits, fabrics like cotton, silk, nylon, wool, rubber, and even leather. So it took a while or it didn't take very long at all for them to just discard unnecessary fabric. Suits started to celebrate the prowess of men, and there was a growing interest in bodybuilding. And many ads from the time were quite daring, and this is actually one of the ones that was considered extremely scandalous. This is James Garner in 1947 in a Janssen ad, and it was considered scandalous at the time, but I want you to note that there's one part of his body that's still covered, and that is kind of the point of modesty, and that's his belly button. You can't see his belly button. And when we move into bikinis, this is where it hits, this is where it gets real. So, 1940s pre-bikini. In 1942, Regulation L835 limited the use of natural fibers in clothing and mandated a 10% reduction in fabric on women's swimsuits. Two-piece suits became the norm, and they often got rid of that modesty skirting and other non-essential fabric. Following the fashions of the day, they included ruching and sweetheart necklines. By the end of the war, two-piece suits were rather ubiquitous on American beaches. Now we get to the bikini. So, do you guys see a difference between those two pieces and this one? So on July 5th, 1946, French designer Louis Réard debuted his bikini at a swimming pool in Paris. And it was actually considered so scandalous that even the French, like that was the point, like even with stretch, even the French models wouldn't wear it. And so he had to hire a stripper to model it. And that's her picture there. Her name is Micheline Bernardini. And she is wearing the original bikini that debuted in Paris. Now, the two biggest differences were the high leg cuts and showing the belly button. So it's named the bikini because it was said to have the same impact on women's swimwear as the atomic bomb had on the Bikini Atoll. So that's why we call it the bikini. However, in the 1950s, there was a resurgence of something called the cult of domesticity, and that is the idea that men are the breadwinners and women are in the home. And so a lot of these advancements that had made up until now kind of backtracked a little bit. And so it shifted back towards modesty. So women's skirts or women's suits soon got that skirting again along the bottom. And they also added boning so that it was, again, not quite a corset, but it was shaping it into that feminine shape of the day. Men's and women's suits, though, did come in colorful prints and patterns thanks to new synthetic printing processes, and these were often done in Hawaiian or Japanese prints. Excuse me. This is also when we start to see the teen beach movie craze, so you start to see films like Where the Boys Are and Gidget and just all these beach blanket bingo, like all these films and shows were revolving around this like beach culture. Then in the 1960s, you get social revolution. So that was a time of the itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini. So the 60s were social, sexual, and fashion revolutions, and the swimsuits were reflecting it. Thanks to a rise in private swimming pools, bikinis became more common once again, although they were still fairly loose fitting. Australian brand Speedo was introduced, and men's shorts became even more brief than before, though the trunks did remain popular. But this was, so you'll see here that suits are still relatively low on women's legs. You don't get that high cut again of that original bikini. But this was also when Lycra was introduced, and it was a tight fitting fabric that left little to the imagination. So suits were tighter than ever before. Also this time, suits did tend to be made out of unconventional fabrics like corduroy, terry cloth, and denim. And then in 1964, the monokini was introduced. And the monokini is basically just a pair of briefs, which had two small straps that literally didn't cover a darn thing. So the top was completely exposed. And as you can imagine, that was probably more popular in Europe than it ever did get here in the United States. In the 1970s, the hippie movement influenced the design of suits. It shed the last vestiges of modesty of the traditional generations that had come before, and the younger generation was all about just freeing themselves. Men's cutoff shorts became popular and allowed for active swimming and leisurely lounging. And from this point on in history, the men's shorts looks kind of fluctuate between looser boxer style shorts and shorter, tighter trunks. Women's suits embraced the higher, tighter leg openings. They crept higher. The string bikini is introduced at this time, and Farrah Fawcett made waves in her tight one-piece suit with a high leg opening that left very little to the imagination about her. In the 1980s, the men's suits evolution was relatively tame at this time. New fabrics like neoprene were introduced, and there was a resurgence in interest of bodybuilding, so you do start to see men in those what we call Speedos. And Lycra briefs became popular among men because of their tightness, which allowed them to show off their physiques. Women's suits, though, all about the bold patterns, so neon colors and animal prints were extremely popular. V-hips, which is that hip that goes extremely high, exposing the hip bone, and deeply scooped necklines became popular at this stage, and full butt coverage was slowly becoming a thing of the past. In fact, the thong swimsuit was introduced in the 1980s, which took its inspiration from the Brazilian tanga. The 1990s saw a rise of California surf culture with loose-fitting board shorts that became the preference for men. They sat lower on the hips and typically reached down to the knees. In terms of women, though, extreme high leg cuts, cheeky bottom coverage, and side boobs were the popular trends, and they were exemplified by one of the most popular shows of the era, which is Baywatch. So you can see here they've got the very extreme V cuts, deep scoop necklines, and then extremely form-fitting as well. The triangle bikini was introduced from Brazil and leading to a trend of the barely there bikini. And they often had like the cups of the swimsuit tops were all like 3 inches across maximum. So extremely tiny. And then the 1990s also saw the introduction of the tankini, and it was introduced to give the freedom of the mix and match opportunities of the bikini, but with a little bit more coverage. So beachwear today. Today's swimsuit styles are extremely varied as the people wearing them. Men's trunks typically hit mid-thigh and are slim fitting, but again, options do exist like Speedos and bigger board shorts and briefs, all sorts of different styles. High-waisted suits with vintage details have made a comeback in recent years, and one-piece suits have also experienced a resurgence in popularity thanks to fashionable details and cutouts and different things like that. And then there are also suits that cater to more modest with mass production seen on items like the Bikini, which is pictured here, so that everybody can really wear what they want at the beach and really feel comfortable. We live in a great time in terms of swimsuits right now, and we've kind of shed the modesty that existed before, and are more about celebrating the body and athleticism while still being fashionable in some cases though too. So thank you for joining us tonight for this presentation from bloomers to bikinis, a brief history of beachwear. I hope that you take away a lot of interesting information from this presentation and that you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed doing a lot of the research on this, and thank you again. Please do consider checking out more of our History at Home programs. You can find information on those on any of the museum websites and also at Alexandria Education, Community Education. Thank you and have a good night.